In April of 1945, an American officer told 73 German women to take off their wedding rings. Not their weapons, not their papers, their rings. The women were standing in a railway siding outside Liège, ankle-deep in black mud, surrounded by boxcars that smelled of wet wood, coal smoke, and old fear. They had already been searched once that morning. Pockets turned out, bags emptied, names checked against damp lists, coats shaken until crumbs and lint fell into the mud. Then the order came through an interpreter. All valuables will be surrendered for registration: rings, watches, necklaces, medals, money. Place them in your right hand and step forward when called. For 1 second nobody moved. The rain had softened to mist. It settled on their hair, on their caps, on the cracked leather of their boots. A few women folded their hands behind their backs. One pressed 2 fingers against the chain under her collar. Another stared straight ahead, as if discipline could make the sentence disappear. Near the middle of the line stood Marta Keller, 31 years old, a former municipal typist from Dresden who had spent the last 2 years of the war in a Wehrmacht signals office, copying numbers from one failing front to another. On the 3rd finger of her left hand was a narrow gold wedding band. It was not bright anymore. It had been dulled by coal dust, soap rationing, and the sharp edges of field desks. But inside the band were 3 tiny marks she could still feel with her thumb. HKMB 2939. Hans Keller, Marta Bauer, September 2, 1939. The day after Europe caught fire. Hans had slipped it on her finger in a registry office because the church had been full of soldiers' weddings, and there had been no time to wait. He had been 28, a railway draftsman with ink on his cuffs and a habit of measuring everything twice. He had smiled when the clerk mispronounced Marta's middle name. Then he had kissed her hand as if the whole room did not smell of paper, damp wool, and fear. 3.5 years later, a telegram said he was missing near Kharkov. Missing meant there was no grave, no body, no final coat button, no last letter, just a typed sentence and a ring. Marta had worn that ring through the Dresden fires, through cellars packed so tightly people slept sitting up. Through the morning she crawled out and saw streets she knew turned into powdered brick, through retreat orders, ration lines, and the slow collapse of the country that had demanded everything from her and returned almost nothing. Now an American lieutenant wanted it in a wooden tray. And the worst part was that Marta had been expecting this. For days, the captured women had traded the same stories in whispers. Americans stole gold, Americans kept watches, Americans called it processing and then sold everything in New York. Someone had heard of a cousin who lost his father's pocket watch in a camp in France. Someone else swore the British had taken wedding bands from prisoners and never gave them back. The stories grew because fear needed something to eat, and Nazi radio had fed it for years. In the last months of the war, the broadcasts had stopped sounding like news and started sounding like fever. Allied soldiers were criminals. Americans were grinning thieves with clean uniforms and empty souls. Captivity was humiliation first, survival second. The enemy would strip Germany down to its teeth and laugh while doing it. Marta had not believed all of it, but she had believed enough because she had seen what collapse did to decent people. She had seen a neighbor steal firewood from a widow. She had seen a clerk hide extra ration stamps under his floorboards. She had seen men quote law in the morning and break it by nightfall because nobody was left with the power to stop them. So when the American officer said the rings would be cataloged and returned, Marta did not hear a promise. She heard a lie with paperwork around it. The line started moving. At the front, a young woman handed over a silver cross. The officer asked her name. A sergeant wrote it in a ledger. The cross went into a small envelope. A number went on the envelope. A matching number went on a receipt card, then a watch, then a chain, then another ring. Name, description, number, receipt. The routine was so calm it almost made the women angrier. Marta watched the tray fill with the last objects people had protected when entire cities could not be protected. A cracked nurse's watch, a school pin, a locket with no photograph left inside, rings that had been hidden under gloves, sewn into hems, carried in mouths during searches, protected with a desperation no regulation could fully understand. Beside Marta stood Inge Vogel, a kitchen worker from Essen, 22 years old and too thin for her coat. She had a man's signet ring tied to a black thread around her neck. "My brother," she whispered, "Stalingrad." She untied the thread so slowly the interpreter had to tell her to step forward. When she came back with only a card in her hand, her face had gone blank. "They said number 608, she said, as if a number can be a brother. Then the interpreter called Keller Marta. For a moment, Marta could not feel her legs. She stepped under the tarp where rain hammered softly above the table. The American lieutenant was maybe 35, with tired eyes and a jaw darkened by a day of shaving mist. He did not look triumphant. He did not look cruel. That almost made it harder. Cruelty would have made sense. Efficiency did not. Name, the interpreter asked. Marta Keller. Date of birth? October 4th, 1913. The sergeant wrote. The lieutenant looked at her left hand. Marta closed it into a fist before she realized she had moved. The lieutenant waited. He did not grab her. He did not raise his voice. He simply held out his palm. The interpreter said, more softly this time, the ring must be registered. Marta turned the band once around her finger. The skin beneath it was pale, a thin white circle that belonged to a different life. Her knuckle was swollen from cold and from weeks of carrying her own bundle like a refugee. The ring resisted when she pulled. An American corporal stepped forward with a small tin of grease. The interpreter nodded toward it. To help. Marta stared at the tin as if it were an insult. The offer was almost kind. That was why she hated it. No, she said. She twisted harder. The band scraped over the knuckle, caught, and then came free so suddenly she almost dropped it into the mud. The ring lay in her palm, small and ordinary, too small to hold a dead husband, too small to hold a burned city, too small to be the last evidence that somebody had once chosen her before uniforms, raids, and telegrams had swallowed everything. But it was all she had. The lieutenant reached for it. Marta held it one heartbeat longer. Then she let it fall into his palm. He did not pocket it. He turned it once, read the inside engraving, and repeated it to the sergeant. Gold wedding band, interior engraving, HKMB, 2 September, 1939. Worn condition, the sergeant wrote every word. The ring went through a paper tag on a thin wire. The wire was threaded carefully, not scraping the gold. The tag read 612. The ring went into a brown envelope. The envelope was sealed. The number 612 was written across it in black pencil, then copied into the ledger beside Marta's name. Then the lieutenant handed her a card. It carried the same number. Keep this, the interpreter said. You will need it when property is returned. Marta looked at the card. It was already damp at the edge. What if it is lost? She asked. The interpreter translated. The lieutenant answered without impatience. Her name is in the book. The card helps. The ledger is the record. The ledger is the record. Marta almost laughed. A ledger had not saved Hans. A registry office had not saved their marriage from war. A ration card had not made bread appear when the shelves were empty. Germany had been full of records. Lists, permits, stamps, forms, inventories, transport papers. The records had survived longer than the people. She closed her fingers around the card and stepped back into the line. That afternoon, when the valuables were done, the lieutenant called 2 soldiers to the table. Marta watched because she could not stop watching. The envelopes were stacked in metal boxes. The boxes were locked. The keys went onto a chain around the lieutenant's neck. He signed the ledger. The sergeant signed beneath him. A second officer countersigned. Then the lieutenant said something in English, sharp enough that even the German women understood it mattered. The interpreter translated for the guards. Prisoner property will remain under escort until delivered to the camp property officer. Unauthorized possession of any item will be treated as theft under military law. The guards straightened. Marta heard Ing breathe out beside her. Military law, not kindness, not trust. Something harder, a rule with teeth. They left Belgium 3 days later in sealed rail cars. Then came a port full of cranes and gray water, and a troop transport crossing an ocean Marta had only seen on school maps. The women slept in stacked bunks bolted to sweating metal walls. The ship rolled so hard the buckets were never empty. The food was strange, white bread too soft to trust, coffee too strong, tinned meat so rich it made half the women sick. Every night Marta touched the empty place on her finger. The absence felt like a wound that made no blood. She carried the card in the lining of her jacket. She had sewn a slit there with thread pulled from her blanket. Every few hours she checked it, in the dark, in line for food. After the ship horn sounded, after a guard shouted, after waking from the same dream. In the dream, envelope 612 was opened in front of her. Inside was dust. After 11 days, the ship entered an American harbor at dawn. The skyline rose out of fog, whole and unburned. Warehouses stood with windows intact. Rail tracks ran straight. Cranes moved cargo as if the world had not ended anywhere. One woman whispered, "So this is what victory looks like." No one answered. They were taken inland by train for 2 days, through towns with painted houses, cattle in green fields, and children who waved from road crossings before their mothers pulled them back. The final camp stood in Arkansas, a grid of wooden barracks under a heavy wet heat that made Marta's wool uniform feel like punishment. At the gate was a sign in English and German. Prisoner of war Englischer auf Ors Personnel only. Inside, everything had a number. Beds, mess tins, work details, laundry bundles, meal lines, latrine buckets. The Americans seemed to believe that if a thing could be numbered, it could be controlled. Marta had once believed that too. The processing building smelled of soap, disinfectant, paper, and electric fans. The women were deloused, examined by nurses, issued gray cotton dresses with PW stenciled across the back, and marched into a final room marked property and wreckers. That was where Marta saw the shelves. Rows of them. Metal floor to ceiling. Each shelf divided into compartments, each compartment labeled with ranges of numbers. On the desk sat 3 ledgers, a typewriter, a stamp pad, and a wooden tray for opened envelopes. Behind the desk sat a warrant officer with silver hair, rimless spectacles, and the exhausted patience of a man who had corrected sloppy paperwork for 30 years. A German prisoner working as interpreter spoke for him. Any property collected at capture will be verified here. You will confirm the description. A formal receipt will be issued. The property will remain in storage until release. The women began lining up. Marta felt the card inside her jacket like a hot coal. Number 604 was a wristwatch with a broken clasp. Number 607 was a rosary. Number 608 was Ingie's signet ring on its black thread. When Ingie saw it, her mouth opened but no sound came out. The warrant officer let her hold it long enough to confirm the initials. Then he returned it to the envelope, typed a receipt, stamped it twice, and placed the envelope into a steel drawer. Not a tray, not a pocket, a drawer. Then he called, "Keller, Marta." 612. The room narrowed. The warrant officer stood, crossed to the numbered shelves, and pulled out a sealed brown envelope without searching. 612. Marta could see the black pencil from where she stood. He slit the edge with a small knife and tipped the contents into his palm. Her ring rolled once and stopped against his thumb. It had crossed an ocean and remained itself. The scratches were the same. The dullness was the same. Inside, when he turned it toward the light, the letters were still there. HKMB 2.939. The interpreter said, "You may verify." Marta took the ring between 2 fingers. Her hands were shaking so badly the gold flashed in the fanlight. She felt the inner marks with her nail. Hans's initials, her own, the date, still cut into metal, still real. "It is mine," she said. Her voice sounded like somebody else's. The warrant officer nodded. He did not ask about Hans. He did not soften his face into pity. He simply wrote the confirmation into a ledger and typed a receipt that described the ring so exactly, it seemed almost absurd. 1 gold wedding band. Interior engraving HKMB 2939. Plain worn, no stones. Condition verified at intake. The form said the property would be held in secure storage and returned upon repatriation. It said inspections could be requested through camp authority and relief representatives. It said the receipt did not replace the ledger but supported the claim. Marta read the words twice. Then the warrant officer stamped the paper so hard the desk jumped. For the first time since Belgium, Marta wondered if the Americans were not pretending. Not because they were gentle, because their system did not need to like her in order to function. Camp life became a calendar made of repeated things. Roll call at 6. Oatmeal with milk, work detail, mail call, Sunday inspection, lights out. Marta was assigned to the records hut because she could type 80 words a minute and keep columns straight. She copied supply requests for blankets, soap, coal, flour, medical gauze, and lamp oil. The work was familiar in a way that made her feel ashamed. She had done the same kind of work for a war machine that had eaten Europe. Now she did it for the army guarding her. The typewriter keys sounded the same in both places. That was one of the things she hated most. On a shelf in her barracks, between a Red Cross soap packet and a tin cup, Marta kept the property receipt folded inside a small Bible somebody else had abandoned. She did not read the Bible. She used it because nobody stole from one. At night, women argued about the valuables. Inge believed her brother's ring would be returned because she had seen it with her own eyes. A former postal clerk named Ruth did not. "You saw them show it to you," Ruth said. "That is not the same as getting it back." "They wrote it down," Inge answered. "They wrote down train schedules, too." That ended the conversation, because everyone knew records could serve evil as easily as order. A number could protect a person. A number could erase one. A ledger could keep a promise. A ledger could send a train east. Marta understood both truths, and neither helped her sleep. In June, 2 relief inspectors arrived at the camp. A Swiss man with a narrow face and a woman with a gray bun so severe it looked carved from stone. They toured the kitchen, the infirmary, the barracks, the wire perimeter, and finally the property room. 3 prisoners from each barracks were chosen to verify stored items. Marta's name was on the list. She tried not to show what that did to her. In the property office, the warrant officer opened the steel drawers under the inspector's eyes. Numbers were read aloud. Envelopes were matched to ledgers. Receipts were compared against descriptions. When they reached 612, the Swiss woman opened the envelope herself. She placed the ring on a clean white cloth. For a moment, Marta could not breathe. There it was again. Not rumor, not promise. Object. The Swiss inspector read from the receipt. 1 gold wedding band, interior engraving H. KMB 2939, plain worn, no stones. She turned the ring and found the engraving. Confirmed. Then she looked at Marta. Would you like to hold it? Marta nodded. She picked it up and without thinking, slipped it onto her finger. The band settled into the pale groove it had left behind. 8 weeks without it and her hand remembered. She kept it there for only 3 seconds. Long enough to feel the weight. Long enough to feel Hans not as a telegram but as pressure against her skin. Then she removed it and handed it back. That was the first time she cried in American captivity. Not when she was captured. Not when she crossed the ocean. Not when Germany surrendered. When the enemy's paperwork kept a promise she had been certain it would break. In July, a letter from Dresden reached her. Her mother was alive. That was the first miracle. The second was that she told the truth. The apartment was gone. Their street was mostly cellar holes and standing chimneys. 17 people slept underground in rooms that used to store coal. Food was measured in ladles. Coal was traded like gold. Men came at night to pry copper from ruins. A neighbor had stolen Marta's father's service medal from a box under a blanket. Not because the metal was valuable, but because everything small and metallic had become currency. Her mother wrote, "Do not mourn the medal. I am trying not to. But every object we lose makes the past smaller." Marta read that line until the paper softened under her thumb. Every object we lose makes the past smaller. Her ring was locked in a steel drawer by the people she had feared would steal it. Her father's medal was gone in the city that had raised her. There was no easy lesson in that. No clean moral. Just a world turned upside down so completely that enemy hands could become safer than familiar rooms. After that letter, Marta stopped laughing when the warrant officer crossed the yard with his leather satchel. She still did not mistake procedure for mercy. Procedure could be cold. It could be blind. It could be cruel when aimed by cruel people. But in that camp, with that ring, procedure became something else. A wall between her grief and everybody else's appetite. By January 1946, the camp had changed from prison to waiting room. Lists appeared on notice boards. Repatriation groups were formed by region. Women counted days, then stopped counting when transport schedules changed. Some wanted to go home so badly they packed a month early. Others dreaded it. Home had become a word with teeth. Marta's name appeared on Transport Group 14. Destination Bremerhaven. Departure February 6th. The night before she left, she took out her receipt and smoothed it flat on her bunk. The paper was creased, handled, stained at one corner by coffee. But the stamp was still visible. The number was still clear. 612. Ing sat across from her, turning her brother's property receipt in her hands. "Do you think they really give them back tomorrow?" Ing asked. Marta looked at the receipt. "Yes," she said. It surprised both of them. The next morning, the women lined up outside Property and Records before dawn. Frost silvered the boards. Their breath showed white in front of their faces. They carried one small bag each. Clothes, letters, Red Cross parcels, scraps of paper with addresses that might no longer exist. Inside, the warrant officer had 3 ledgers open and a stack of final release forms ready. One by one, the women stepped forward. A watch returned, a chain returned, a locket returned. Inga's brother's signet ring returned. She tied it back around her neck with shaking hands. Then the officer called, "Keller, Marta, 612. This time, Marta did not step forward like someone walking to a loss. She stepped forward like someone approaching a verdict. The warrant officer opened the drawer, removed the envelope, checked the number, broke the seal, and tipped the ring into his palm. 1 gold wedding band, the interpreter read. Interior engraving HKMB 2 September 1939. Plain worn, no stones, returned intact. The officer held it out, not for inspection, for return. Marta took the ring. For a moment she saw everything at once. Hans in the registry office. Dresden burning. The Belgian rail yard. The American lieutenant threading wire through the band. The ship. The steel drawer. The white cloth under the inspector's hands. Her mother's sentence about the past getting smaller. Then she slid the ring onto her finger. It passed over the knuckle and settled into the old groove. The body remembers what grief cannot explain. The officer placed a form in front of her. Acknowledgement of returned property. She signed her name carefully. The way she had signed documents before the war made every signature feel like surrender. Then she looked up. There were many things she could have said, and none of them would have been enough. So she used one of the few English phrases she trusted. "Thank you." The warrant officer nodded once. "Safe home, ma'am." Ma'am. Not enemy. Not prisoner. Not number 612. Just a woman leaving with what was hers. The train took them east. The ship took them back across the Atlantic. The sea was calmer than before, or maybe Marta had changed enough that fear could not use the waves the same way. On the deck, women touched the objects returned to them. watches that no longer kept time, crosses with bent chains, rings that fit tighter after hunger and winter, photographs carried in paper sleeves, small things, ordinary things, made enormous because history had failed to swallow them. Inge stood beside Marta with the signet ring at her throat. "They gave it back," she said. Marta looked at the gold band on her hand. "Yes," she said, "they did." The coast of Europe appeared through fog 14 days later. Not the Europe she had left. That place was gone. The Germany waiting for her was hungry, broken, occupied, and full of ghosts. But on her finger was a circle of gold that had crossed the ocean twice. It had passed through enemy hands, army ledgers, locked drawers, inspection sheets, and release forms. It had survived not because anyone loved her husband, not because anyone understood what the ring meant, not because war had become gentle at the end. It survived because for once a rule held, and in a world that had taught Marta Keller that every promise could burn, one stamped receipt brought back the last thing fire had not taken.